So I just want to welcome everyone to my course, L Forms 202, Forms 5 BPMN Process Design. My name is Wesley Chen, and I'm a pre-sales consultant here at Laserfiche. My primary responsibilities are to deal with configuration issues with the software, as well as answer questions of a technical nature. Along with me is Dustin. He's going to be a backup. He's part of the Forms team, and if there's any questions about the direction of the design of Forms or something more technical and more in-depth, he'll be able to answer for you. Let's get started. So this class is geared towards people who are interested in designing business processes. That means that you're taking real-life processes you have in your company, whether it's a check approval process in the finance department, or you have some sort of new hire onboarding in the HR department. You're going to take that, model it, and diagram every little aspect of it, and that's what you're interested in. That being said, it's geared towards people who are actually designing the business processes and not so much the Forms users that are dealing with the actual form filling out the content. So you're also interested in gaining business value from these diagrams. So you want to take these diagrams and gain the value from automating the business process, taking the more mundane task and pushing it towards the machine to handle. So that's another reason why you might be interested in this class. Here's a roadmap of where we'll be heading today. We're going to take a look at why BPMN is useful. And for those of you who need to understand the acronym, it means Business Process Modeling Notation. And then we're going to jump into a new feature called Teams and how you can group users and do the task assignments in Forms. We're also going to take a look at timer events, a super helpful feature that allows you to build in the various different time concerns that you might have from your business process. And finally, we're going to end with gateways, the foundation of Forms, the ability to control where business process flow goes. So jumping right into it, business process modeling notation. We use this standard for mapping out Forms diagrams because it appeals to the broadest spectrum of users across all organizational units in a company. So here's just a few quotes. BPMN can be likened in a story. So we should think about it as a stakeholder in a process, some sort of executive. They're interested in automating and diagramming some process, and I've mentioned a few earlier. And so they would go to the more technical person, the IT person, the business analyst, and ask them, hey, can you help me with this task? That technical person would then develop a process diagram, maybe automate certain parts, like sending out emails that are automatically sent out after certain activities, and they would go back and have to show this to the executive. Well, through BPMN notation, we're able to have this common means of communication so you can communicate back and forth between two organizational units of people in different roles. And it just likens how helpful having this common notation is. And that's pretty much why Forms uses notation. And so Forms has three main categories of different elements that you can include in your business process diagrams, starting with events. Events can be thought of as triggers. So when the process is flowing through and it hits an event, something just happens. And so we have various different events to account for different occurrences. Starting with the green ones, we can start the business process. And you can start it in different ways. So with the first one, you can have it with content being introduced in your business process. Now, the second start event is below the end event, and we'll get into that in a little moment. But that's where you're starting the form process based on a schedule. Then further down the line, when you might need that time element again, we're bringing it back with an intermediate timer event. And so you can actually have events that occur in the middle of a business process. And finally, end events designate the end of a certain business process branch. And so these events, again, can be thought of as triggers. When the business process gets there, it just happens. Something happens. Next, we have activities. Activities can be thought of as things that involve other tasks or something that when you get there, something is done by some entity. Starting the first one, user task. Essentially, if you have some sort of approval process or a submission where you require someone to bring in additional content in the business process, you would bring in a participant using the user task, and that would be that kind of activity. Going to the next one, a service task. This brings in service from another machine. In this case, workflow. Workflow would come and interact with and bring information into the forms process. That's what that does. And then finally, sub-processes allows you to bring in segments of smaller forms processes, putting it into this one activity and putting that activity into a larger business process diagram. Finally, we have gateways. As I mentioned, this is a foundation of one of the foundations of forms, the ability to control process flow. Without this ability, you wouldn't really be able to regulate where your content goes and how it gets there. So we're looking at this. We have 3 different gateways. One that covers each logical condition that you can think of. Starting with exclusive gateways, this represents the OR condition. So that's where one path is taken that's connected to it. Inclusive gateways represents the AND condition, so one or more paths. And then finally, parallel gateways, all paths. Everything that's connected to it, it just happens. And this is good and all. We have these different elements we can include in our business process, but we have to understand what we're working with. Essentially, this is a form. It has various different fields you can fill in. It has certain restrictions you can apply to force people to submit content a certain way, such as dates. Maybe we want the dates to be 2 digits followed by a dash, 2 digits followed by 4 dashes. We can do that, followed by 4 digits. We can do that. And you can take unstructured content that's out there, structure it, and bring it in to a process diagram and kick off the process diagram. And going back to why we began on this road, BPMN is very simple to understand. Taking a look at this, you can see this comprises of an activity, some gateways, but we know this is an approval activity. Being a little familiar with it, you can at a glance understand what's going on in your business process diagram. And that's why Forms follows the BPMN notation. Just to recap, BPMN standardizes the modeling notation and allows this ease of communication across different organizational units. Before we move on, does anyone have any questions? Yes? Depending on how you put together the various different events and activities, and there are more events that I didn't cover on that diagram. As it goes forward in the flow, it triggers in the sequence that you put it in the process flow, if that makes any sense. And it would be specific to how you build your forms process. Essentially, when the process gets to whatever it is, whether it's an event or activity, then that takes over. So does an activity trigger an event? You could think of it that way if you have an activity that stops the business process and you have to interact with that activity until you get to the event. Otherwise, they're separate unless they're connected by the process diagram flow. If that makes sense.
Since these activities can now be named, wouldn't it make sense that we could not have to use a separate application for diagramming? You could literally, for small processes, begin to name the process and activities
So for best practices, if you're engaging with a forms design process, I recommend just starting off with a simple flow on a piece of paper, or in the case, if you have some sort of program like Visio, you can definitely diagram the process, understanding what components of even Laserfiche that you need to bring into your current situation. And sometimes you might even want half of it to be taken care of by forms and half of it to be taken care of by workflow, depending on what the needs are. But starting off that process, diagramming outside of forms before you start building, because going back and doing cleanup work can be time intensive. Does that answer your question? Yes.
Just for communication, I know we've had some miscommunication. What exactly is included in business process? Are they talking about the forms process model there? Are they talking about a workflow converted to BPMN? And is that all under the same umbrella of what a business process could entail? Does that make sense?
When you're in a different module, I guess there are business processes in forms and there's business processes in workflow, but they entail different aspects.
You just call them all business process.
Yeah, it's all part of a larger scale, a broad view of business processes. But in workflow, it would entail those activities that you add to the workflow. In forms, it would entail the different elements that we covered that you can add to a forms business process. Before we move forward, any other questions? Great. And we have this understanding of this common notation, but now we also need to assign these tasks out to certain users. And how do we do that? That'd be the question. Well, with Forms 10, we introduced teams, which is a way of being able to handle task assignment. And I like to introduce this concept through a scenario. We're looking at this insurance company where they have this business process. They bring in new potential business applications. The agents go out, they see a potential client, they like to submit the documentation, and also appended to it might be other validating documentations as well as a contract of some sort. And they have two teams internally that need to review these documents. One is the legal team, and two is the suitability team. But these two teams have two really different criteria of how tasks should be assigned to them. So again, the legal team and suitability team. First, the legal team. They have a team of people who review the application, they review the contracts, but they review it maybe for liability issues or different aspects where accepting this business might be detrimental later on. And in their team, they have varying levels of experience, maybe even have separate little team groupings in the legal team that handle different types of contracts. Next, we have the suitability team, and this is just people who follow an internal process. They take a look at a packaged application and see, are all the documents in line? Does it have everything that it needs to? If not, we're just going to send it back, right? And so these two teams have these different requirements. We would assign them to teams. The teams feature in forms. And I just want to show this screen because this is how you might assign a team back on our previous diagram. We would go to that activity where some participant needs to be assigned to it. We can affect which team, assign it to certain groupings. Brief mention, we're also able to do deadlines here. So if there's a certain deadline that needs to be adhered to, you can apply that here.
Can you have multiple teams?
Yes, you can have. With different rights? How do you mean by different rights?
Like if you want to have a team that could reassign the work or the process, and then have another team that's just viewing their auditors, they can't change anything.
So the way that would be that it's not that the teams can interact with each other's team queue, but you would structure it in a way where certain teams are put together for a certain functionality. I think we talked a little bit earlier about having some sort of watch list of participants that don't really deal with any activity in the forms process, but just watch as the process is going through. You can definitely create a team grouping of these people who are stakeholders in the process. They just want to see it, and then add them as read-only participants, yes. And so with teams, you have many different ways of being able to assign tasks. Starting off with team roles, you can give these different members of the team different properties, so then you can identify who should normally get what kind of task. And this might be useful for the legal team, where you need to organize in that way and send it to specific members of the legal team if they need to deal with a certain type of task. We also have round robin, which is an automatic assignment. It will just go through the team, and this might be helpful in the suitability team because it doesn't matter who gets a task, it just has to go through an order, since the task is pretty much the same, and any person in the team, regardless of their experience or their time at the company, can take on the task. Finally, team queue is this ability to be able to bring tasks into a list, have a designation as a manager or a member of the team, and as the manager, you would be able to go in the queue and take a task and assign it to one of the members. And as a member, you would be able to draw from the queue for yourself to be able to interact with the task. Brief mention, currently, if you're using forms, you would also have the ability to have the participants added to the task as well. Before we move on, does anyone have any questions about that? Yes?
If someone's part of the team, but they're not available, like they're out of the office for 2 weeks or something, how do they, if you're doing round robin, how do you keep them from getting work?
You could have a manager that would just then pull from it, give it to someone else.
It's manual, it's not, there's no way to like keep them out of the queue for a time range.
Do we have any? No. I don't think so, but if you have a very compelling use case, we recommend that you talk to the user studies. That'd be an interesting possibility, yes.
Can a user be a member of multiple teams?
Yeah. All right. And so, oh, yes.
Do you need to accept that task, or that's there for you? Can you accept or reject a task?
So if you give that participant the ability to do so, you can do that. That's the members affecting the team queue. But if you don't want that, then you can probably take it away, right?
Yeah. So basically, there are multiple ways to assign the task to like a team. It can be, if you don't assign it round robin, it will be given to everybody and they can manually accept the task from any member within the team. Or you can do like a filter so only certain roles can accept the task. You can do round robin on top of these filters so that they initially are assigned the task, but they can also release the task back to all the other users. And finally, a manager could always take over and reassign it from any of their users.
So we have this understanding of how we can do task assignments, and through the course of normal business, we might also have special occurrences of time-related issues that we need to deal with, such as auditors that come in, or maybe we have best practices we need to adhere to, or just simple deadlines. We would affect that by using timer events, and I'm going to illustrate this through an example. So we have this story of this vacation resort company, and they have currently 3 facilities with 400 employees. But they're currently expanding to a 4th facility, and we know that that's going to bring in a lot of new applications, new hires, and all that. So they want, for best practices, to maintain certain criteria, such as a 3-day reminder, a soft reminder for the reviewer in case they get off task. And finally, 6 days is just way too long for the applicant to be waiting for this one reviewer to get back to his application, so they need some sort of escalation. We can account for this by having a timer-related event. And so in this business process, you can think of it as two different parts. So the first part is the application coming in. The reviewer gets the task with that activity, and if they don't get to it in 3 days, then they're going to be sent a soft reminder, an email. It goes forward, and that's the gateway that triages the approval or rejection. So as the application comes in, the timer gets engaged 3 days after. Hopefully, the reviewer gets his task and continues along. But as we understand the scenario, there's also a 6-day requirement. What if the reviewer doesn't get to it within 6 days? Then it's way overdue for best practices. We would build in another different timer event. So this timer event is a little different than the first one. You can see by the solid lines. This timer event can be thought of as an interrupt timer. So as 6 days passes by, and we'll see in a second, so the normal process occurs. The reviewer gets a task, 3 days passes by, they still don't get back to reviewing the application. The second timer will kick in, and it will interrupt the activity it's dependent on and bring it to a manager for escalation. The manager will continue the review process and maybe speak to that certain reviewer employee about going over the 6 days. And so with these two timer events, we're able to account for soft reminders and even hard escalations and various different time-related business processes that you might have. Okay, so with that, we'll get into the next part, gateways, one of the foundations of forms, the ability to control process flow and where the process goes. We can think of gateways in this analogy of pipes. So as water flow comes in, and that can be the content that you're bringing through your business process, you have various different pipes to deal with that water flow to get to this destination, whether it's a house or some sort of residential neighborhood. We have a two-way split where the water comes in one way and splits with two pipes. We can also have a pipe that goes 4 ways, a 3-way split, and there's a valve. And that valve can be turned on and off conditionally based on the need for the water traveling down the pipe. And so with gateways, you're able to account for all these different nuances. Just to recap, we have 3 different gateways covering the different logical operators. First, we have exclusive gateways that represents the OR condition. So one path, the first path that's evaluated that it, meets the conditions is taken. Inclusive gateways, this represents an AND condition, so one or more paths. And this can be, this doesn't exclude the possibility of having a very similar occurrence like the OR condition to occur because it's AND, so it's inclusive. And finally, the ALL. This just takes all paths connected to. And we can think of this through an example of a new hire coming onto this company. And they have 3 different phases in which their application is taken into. The first phase is the actual application process coming into the company and being reviewed by the appropriate department. The second phase is onboarding. So when that application comes in and they're accepted for the job, they need certain things at their work desks or workstation. And finally, a performance review that's scheduled 30 days, 90 days out, where the manager and HR have to review it. Additionally, before we get into the examples, this person is being accepted to the finance department, so that matters for our examples. So the first example is an exclusive gateway, and we have 2 exclusive gateways on this process diagram. As I mentioned, they're getting brought into being considered for the finance department. So we're going to see how exclusive gateways split and merge. As the application comes in from the applicant, they're selected just for the finance department because that's the only department they're interested in. And so it gets routed to that department for review. And as their application is finally reviewed, it comes through to the exclusive gateway to merge the two paths and immediately goes through. Looking at inclusive gateways for the onboarding process is the next phase. So we know that they've been approved for the finance department. They need certain materials to get started on their first day. And right here we have the payroll, we have IT, and we also have the human resources department. But for finance people, they don't necessarily need to go through IT because their workstations are already set up. They have very simple requirements. They have computers already at the workstation. IT might be for more involved members, such as people part of the software department or people who are on the field who need mobile devices. And so this finance person doesn't really need that. As this task comes in for onboarding processing, it's going to go through the inclusive gateway, and it's going to be routed over to payroll first as the condition is accepted. And really, to understand how you set conditions on gateways, I'd recommend playing around with the different gateways in either a forms lab, if you can catch one before the day ends, or just going at home and playing around your forms diagramming. And it's going to go down to the human resources because that's the only other department that needs to prepare materials for the onboarding. Payroll finishes up. It's going to be caught by the inclusive gateway, and it's going to actually wait for when human resources finishes up. And when that finally comes through, it goes forward and this process is done. And then finally, we're adding the parallel gateway. This represents the all condition, and this is just for a performance review. For every employee in this company, performance review needs to go through HR and managers, so that's why we put a parallel gateway here. As a task comes in, they simultaneously get the task, and as they finish, the parallel gateway catches and waits, and once the human resources department is done, it goes through. One notable difference is that the parallel gateway waits for the finishing of all branches before going through of everything that's connected to it, versus the inclusive gateway waits for only the active branches. And so with gateways, we're able to control process flow, the merging and splitting of gateways, as well as incorporate a visual element, which gets back to BPMN. Like thinking about it, looking at the diagram, we know when it's a yellow diamond, it's a gateway. That's what we're dealing with. And just to recap, we looked at BPMN notation, business process modeling notation, and how Forms follows that and how it's helpful. We also took a look at teams and how that might be utilized for task assignment. And we looked at timers and how that can account for various different time-related business processes. And finally, gateways and how that can control process flow. I would recommend that you go and take these classes, but I think the only one that's offered after this course would be Form 6, which occurs right after this course. And as always, we have online resources such as our knowledge base, so you can go look at white papers, any helpful tech files. I know I go there and I learn a lot. As well as Laserfiche Answers, which is our online community where if you have a question about any module Laserfiche, you can pose that question there, and getting an answer, it's really quick, the turnaround. And finally, CPP, our online e-learning module. So we have courses with narration for any type of Laserfiche component that you're interested in learning about. Thank you so much.